I negate. According to utilitarianism, speciesism is morally wrong. First, on case, the syllogism. I have a few observations. First, syllogisms really only point out that something is not logically incoherent. That does not make it necessarily right, since syllogisms are often highly based on wordplay. Second, it is important to note that my opponent doesn't explain 1. What preferences animals actually have, and 2. How do we allocate those preferences. Third, even though the syllogism might work out to seem logical, utilitarianism is much more complicated since it involves the weighing of ends, and to do this one must utilize impact calculuses of all sorts. Fourth, unless he can give an adequate warrant for premise 2, then there is no link to the conclusions. But on to the off case. Theoretical arguments. Contention 1. Preference utilitarianism excludes those without the ability to make logical preferences. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, preference utilitarianism is a theory of value that claims that an agent morally ought to do an act if and only if that act maximizes desire satisfaction or preference fulfillment, regardless of whether the act causes sensations of pleasure. This has two impacts. 1. It assumes agency. Even though some animals are sentient beings, being sentient does not imply moral or logical agency. Only humans have moral or logical agency. As such, preference utilitarianism excludes those that lack the specific agency. 2. It assumes preference making. Giving rights to animals for the sake of being sentient would not meet preference utilitarianism on the fact that animals can't make political or logical or legal preferences in the first place. It even lacks the potentiality to do so. As such, preference utilitarianism would not have a stance on speciesism. Contention 2. If we accept preference utilitarianism, then the notion that my opponent advocates for would turn on its head. Essentially, advocating against speciesism is internally contradictory. Subpoint A. To show this, I establish a scenario. Lion A is hunting a group of gazelles called Group B. Under the logic of preference utilitarianism, we as rational and moral agents have an obligation to step in to prevent Lion A from hunting Group B, because the act of hunting would incur pain, which, according to Peter Singer, is the opposite of one's preferences. By acting to stop Lion A from hunting, preference utilitarianism once again violates itself because the preference to eat has been stopped. Therefore, my opponent's logic double binds and turns itself. Subpoint B. Preference utilitarianism would grant that it is okay to torture animals if that is really an innate preference someone has. Since preference utilitarianism is simply maximizing one's preference, then yes, according to it, depriving animals of rights, torturing, or killing it would be acceptable. Contention 3. Positive rights imply a contractualist aspect to utilitarianism. Insofar as animals can't willingly or autonomously enter into an agreement or consent to an agreement, then positive rights cannot logically be afforded to them. Since dogs can't enter into an agreement with society or the government, then we can't afford dogs the right to vote. Moreover, it is impossible for people to know the preferences of animals, especially when it comes to the decisions made in a polity, so to delegate that power would also not make sense either. Contention 4. Preference utilitarianism would not demand the opposite of speciesism. What utilitarianism is the maximization of good, and in this case, preferences and happiness. Theoretically, utilitarianism would never demand a categorical, as is the statement of the resolution. The only categorical would be to demand a maximization of outcomes. My opponent misunderstands the meaning of utilitarianism by claiming that utilitarianism would logically extend to advocating against a specific belief or act. And this is not a semantical argument. It is rather pointing out the fact that by the nature of what utilitarianism is, a categorical statement could never be made, since that goes against the notions of what utilitarianism is. It is important to weigh ends first and foremost, which leads to my consequentialist arguments. Contention 4. Preference utilitarianism, by the nature of being a consequentialist offshoot, would demand the best outcome or consequence. Affording animal rights would result in the banning of most meat production, forbid the use of animal testing, and ban most amounts of new farming, especially in developing areas. This would be an overall negative effect on society. As such, it would be violating consequentialism, which would override the preference utilitarianism, and that would demand that we don't keep speciesism for the sake of humanity's overarching good. Contention 5. The debt trade-off. Giving animal rights would incur more debt since it would force the creation of governmental legal councils for animals, give animal activists and these councils the right to make legal action, which would incur governmental costs, especially on the state level. And state and the federal budgets are on a brink because of all the debt. Debts are bad because it crowds out the private sector from investments, causes massive inflation, and causes market tension and uncertainty. and affirming the resolution would just cause other countries to perceive even more financial weakness, which would result in Chinese dollar dumping. Dorsch 9. The exploding deficit heightened fears on global bond markets, putting Beijing on the offensive against Washington. There have been more paranoia over foreign flight from U.S. dollar and treasury notes to the SDR currency. The American economy is dependent upon China's willingness to provide loans on the U.S. government. Any precipitous move by Beijing to become a net seller of U.S. Treasury debt runs the risk of igniting a dollar-selling panic. Geithner began a visit to Beijing, and speculation that China might scale back its purchasing Geithner's main objection was to reassure that officials of the Obama's team will safeguard the holdings by bringing down the federal budget deficit and the Fed's policy of flooding the financial markets. Unless we demonstrate a strong commitment to fiscal sustainability, we will then have neither financial stability nor healthy economic growth. And this collapses the economy. Dorsch 9. Trade deficits have turned the United States to the world's largest debtor and dependent upon the whims of foreign nations. If foreign lenders were to reduce their purchasing of U.S. Treasury notes without even dumping their current holdings, U.S. long-term interest rates would zoom higher and the U.S. dollar could crumble. Higher yields on Treasury debt could translate into higher mortgage borrowing rates of homebuyers, while reducing an oil shock to the world economy. The nightmare scares is starting to begin an increasingly realistic proposition. Now this may seem far-fetched, but this argument is being used to highlight the fact that my opponent is disregarding the notions of consequentialism, which is the basis of preference utilitarianism, for the sake of saying speciesism is bad. As such, since economic collapse would result in the prevention of most people's preferences in the United States, and by extension probably resulting in less care for animals, do not affirm this resolution or this syllogism. Thank you.